My in-law called my mother a mistake in a dress in front of 204 wedding guests. My name is Maya Bennett. I'm 28 years old. 3 weeks ago, I stood at the altar in a $12,000 gown, ready to marry into one of Boston's wealthiest families. The Crawfords, 4 generations of old money, a charity foundation that supposedly helped the homeless, and a matriarch who smiled like a knife. When Margaret Crawford grabbed that microphone and humiliated my mother, my fiancé stayed silent. His father laughed. 200 people watched my mom bow her head in shame. I didn't bow. I ripped off my ring, canceled the wedding in front of everyone, and walked out. But here's what the Crawfords didn't know. I'd been quietly collecting evidence on them for 6 months. Secret bank transfers, shell companies, millions in stolen charity money. They thought I was just the seamstress's daughter, the nobody from Dorchester, the girl who should have been grateful. They were very, very wrong. If you're watching this, please subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. To understand how a girl they laughed at brought their entire empire crashing down, I need to take you back to where it all began. I grew up in Dorchester, in a one-bedroom apartment where my mother slept on the sofa so I could have the bed. Helen Bennett raised me alone. No father in the picture, no family money, no safety net. Just her 2 hands and a Singer sewing machine that hummed until midnight most nights. She did alterations for a dry cleaner on Dot Ave, hems, zippers, taking in waists for women who could afford to lose weight for fun. $12 an hour, no benefits, no sick days. The apartment always smelled like fabric and steam. I'd fall asleep to the rhythm of her foot pedal, that steady thump, thump, thump that meant she was still working, still fighting, still making sure I'd have lunch money in the morning. Her hands told the story of her life. Calluses from scissors, tiny scars from needles, fingertips rough as sandpaper from decades of handling cloth. But those hands were always warm when she touched my face, always gentle when she braided my hair for school. Write everything down, she used to tell me. You never know when you'll need proof. So I did. I kept notebooks, receipts, records of every dollar spent, every promise made, every slight I swallowed because fighting back wasn't worth the cost. My mother taught me that survival meant documentation. She just didn't know I'd one day use that lesson to destroy a family worth $200 million. I got a full scholarship to Boston University, graduated with a degree in accounting, landed a job as an internal auditor at Crawford Holdings, one of the biggest real estate development firms in New England. I wasn't the charity case who lucked into a rich family. I was there 2 years before I ever met Ethan Crawford. I earned my place through 12-hour days and audit reports that caught discrepancies nobody else noticed. I was good at my job. Too good, as it turned out. The first time I saw the Crawfords' world from the inside, I thought I was the lucky one. I didn't realize I was walking into a trap that had been set long before I arrived. I met Ethan Crawford during a quarterly audit, 3 years before the wedding that never happened. He was 30 years old, deputy director of development, and the only person in that glass and steel tower who looked at me like I was a human being instead of a line item. Everyone else called me the auditor like it was a disease. Ethan called me Maya. He had that old money look, jaw sharp enough to cut glass, shirts that probably cost more than my rent, a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. But there was something else there too, something almost apologetic, like he knew exactly how much privilege he'd been handed and wasn't sure he deserved it. "You want to grab lunch?" he asked one Tuesday, after I'd spent 3 hours reviewing expense reports in a conference room with no windows. "There's this place around the corner. Nothing fancy. They do great sandwiches." Nothing fancy. That should have been my first clue. We dated for 6 months before he introduced me to anyone from his world. We went to diners instead of restaurants, walked in the park instead of attending galas. He said he liked the quiet. I believed him. "Why haven't I met your family yet?" I asked once, while we shared a plate of nachos at a sports bar in Somerville. His collar was open. His hair was messy from the wind. He looked almost normal. He paused, a chip halfway to his mouth. "They're complicated," he said. "I'm waiting for the right time." The right time. I heard that phrase 47 times over the next year. 47. I counted. He smelled like sandalwood and bergamot, expensive but subtle. His hands were soft when he held mine. He never raised his voice, never made me feel small, never treated me like I was beneath him. But he also never defended me. Not once. Not when it mattered. "They're complicated," he'd say, every time I asked about meeting his parents. I should have known that complicated was just another word for coward. The first time I entered the Crawford house, I wore my best dress. Navy blue, fitted, elegant, but not trying too hard. My mother had made it for my college graduation. She'd spent 3 nights hand-stitching the hem because she wanted it to be perfect. The Crawford estate sat on Beacon Hill like a monument to inherited wealth. Brownstone facade, iron gates, a foyer with a chandelier that could have paid off my student loans. The air smelled like fresh flowers and old money, lilies in crystal vases, lemon polish on antique wood. Margaret Crawford waited for us in the sitting room, 58 years old, platinum hair swept back, a strand of Mikimoto pearls resting against her silk blouse. She smiled when Ethan introduced me, her mouth curved, her eyes didn't move. "Maya," she said, letting my name hang in the air like she was testing it. "What a lovely dress. Is it handmade?" "My mother made it," I said. "She's a seamstress." "How charming." Margaret's gaze swept down to my hemline and back up. "You can always tell." The compliment had teeth. Richard Crawford didn't speak much during dinner. 62 years old, silver hair, a face that looked like it had been carved from the same marble as their fireplace mantel. He sat at the head of a table long enough to seat 20, and he watched me the way a banker watches a credit score. The meal was Wagyu beef and wine that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I could barely taste it. Margaret asked questions in that bright, sharp voice about my job, my apartment, my little neighborhood in Dorchester, and each answer seemed to amuse her for reasons I couldn't quite name. "And your mother," she said, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. "What does she do exactly?" "Alterations," I said. "Custom designs. She's been sewing for 30 years. Margaret lifted her wine glass, took a slow sip, and said nothing at all. That silence said everything. Under the table, Ethan squeezed my hand. But he didn't speak. He didn't defend me. He didn't tell his mother that my mom's work had put me through college, that her hands had made the dress I was wearing, that she was worth more than every pearl around Margaret's throat. He just squeezed my hand and stayed quiet. And I let him. The warnings came slowly, like water seeping through cracks in a foundation. After that first dinner, Margaret sent Ethan a list, not to me, to him. But he showed me, almost apologetically, like he was asking permission to ignore it. Suggestions for Maya's wardrobe. Speech patterns to refine, perhaps she could soften the Boston accent. Appropriate topics for social gatherings. I read that list in his apartment, sitting on his $3,000 couch, and I felt my face burn. "She doesn't mean it badly," Ethan said. "She's just particular." Particular. Another word for cruel. But I swallowed it. I told myself I was marrying Ethan, not his family. I told myself things would change after the wedding, that I'd prove myself, that love was worth the compromise. The engagement party was worse. Margaret requested that I limit my guest list due to space constraints. My mother got 5 invites. 5, for her entire side. The Crawfords had 170. I called my mom to explain. I tried to make it sound reasonable. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "It's okay, sweetheart. I understand." But I heard what she didn't say. I heard 30 years of being invisible, of being overlooked, of smiling through disrespect because fighting back cost more than she could afford. I bit my lip so hard it bled. 2 weeks before the wedding, I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. I was still working at Crawford Holdings, still running audits, still doing my job like nothing had changed. A routine expense review, quarterly reports, normal stuff. Until an email landed in my inbox by mistake. It was meant for Richard Crawford's personal account. A wire transfer confirmation, $200,000, sent to a company called Meridian Bay Consulting LLC. I'd never seen that name in any of our records. Not in the vendor lists, not in the contractor files, not anywhere. My fingers hovered over the delete key. This was probably nothing. A personal expense, none of my business. But my mother's voice echoed in my head. Write everything down. So I did. I opened my notebook, the same kind I'd been keeping since I was 12, and I wrote down the date, the amount, and the company name. I didn't know it then, but that was the first piece of the puzzle, the first crack in the Crawford empire. And the Crawfords had no idea that the woman they dismissed as the seamstress's daughter had just started building a case against them. The morning of my wedding, I woke up in a suite at the Four Seasons Boston, with June sunlight streaming through gauze curtains and a champagne headache I didn't deserve. The room was all cream and gold, fresh flowers on every surface, a view of the public garden, a dress bag hanging from a closet door like a promise. My bridesmaids had left the night before, giggling and tipsy and full of hope for my future. I didn't share it. Something had been sitting wrong in my chest for weeks, a weight I couldn't name. My mother arrived at 7, before anyone else. She brought coffee from the Dunkin' near our old apartment, because even on my wedding day, she couldn't walk past a Dunkin', and a small velvet pouch that I'd never seen before. "Open it," she said. Inside was a handkerchief, cream linen, edges softened by age, embroidered with tiny forget-me-nots in faded blue thread. "This was your grandmother's," Helen said. "She brought it from Ireland when she came over. Had nothing else. Just this, and her hands, and enough stubborn to outlast a famine." I pressed the fabric to my face. It smelled like lavender and old paper. "Keep it in your dress pocket," my mother said, "so I'm always with you." She helped me into my gown. $12,000 of silk and beading that I'd insisted on paying for myself, even though the Crawfords had offered. Some pride isn't for sale. When she zipped me up, her hands were steady. When she turned me toward the mirror, her eyes were wet. "You're so beautiful," she whispered. I looked at our reflection. My mother in her navy dress, the same fabric as my graduation dress, repurposed, recut, made new by her own hands. She'd bought it from a fabric outlet's clearance section, end-of-season sale, $8 a yard. Margaret Crawford would notice. Margaret Crawford always noticed. "You look perfect, Mom," I said. "That dress is beautiful." She smiled, and for a moment everything felt like it might be okay. Then we got to the church, and I saw the seating chart. My mother, row 4, behind Richard's golf buddies, behind the woman who sold them organic produce, behind the former housekeeper who'd been fired 3 years ago but had somehow made the list anyway. Row 4, and I still walked down that aisle. Trinity Church filled like a theater, 204 guests arranged in dark wood pews, crystal chandeliers casting prisms across old stone walls. An organ playing Pachelbel's canon like this was a fairy tale instead of a business arrangement. I watched from the vestibule, clutching my bouquet hard enough to bruise the stems. Margaret Crawford sat in the front row, of course. Cream suit, those pearls, a hat that probably cost more than my car. She was laughing at something Richard said, her head tilted at that perfect society page angle, completely at ease in a world she owned. My mother sat in row 4, alone. The seats next to her were empty because her 5 guests had been split up to balance the room. I should have said something. I should have marched up to that altar and moved her myself. But I was 28 years old and still believing that love could fix unfair things. Still thinking that if I just got through this one day, everything would change. The music shifted. "Here Comes the Bride." I walked down the aisle on my own. No father to give me away, not that I'd ever had one, and I kept my eyes on Ethan. He stood at the altar in his custom tux, tall and handsome and smiling, but his eyes flicked to his mother before they landed on me. Just for a second. A reflex. I should have known then. Father Morrison opened his Bible. The ceremony began. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." A rustle from the front row. Margaret Crawford rising to her feet. Not urgently, gracefully. Like this was always the plan. "Father, if I may," she said, her voice carrying across the church with that practiced ease of someone who'd never been told no. "I'd like to say a few words about our bride." Father Morrison hesitated, caught off guard. He looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at his shoes. Margaret walked to the altar. Someone handed her a microphone, and I stood there, frozen in my $12,000 dress, as my mother-in-law prepared to ruin my life. "I want to say a few words about Maya," Margaret began, smiling at the congregation like she was accepting an award. 204 people smiled back, the polite, anticipatory smiles of guests expecting a toast, a welcome to the family speech. Something warm. I knew better. I could see it in the tilt of her chin, the slight curl at the corner of her mouth. Margaret Crawford was about to perform. "Maya is charming," she said. "Really, she is. She came from such humble circumstances, worked her way up, pulled herself out of, what do they call it, Dorchester." Light laughter rippled through the crowd. The way people laugh at things that aren't quite jokes. "And she's ambitious. You have to admire that. A young woman with so few advantages finding her way into our little world." Margaret gestured at the church, at the flowers, at the crystal and the silk and the old money dripping from every surface. "It's almost like a fairy tale." My hands were shaking. I gripped my bouquet tighter. "Of course, she does need some refinement. We're working on that." Margaret's gaze swept to row 4, to my mother. "And this is her mother, Helen, isn't it? A seamstress. She made that dress herself." Silence. Then Margaret smiled, that knife-sharp smile I'd seen 100 times at family dinners. "You can always tell." A few chuckles, nervous now, uncomfortable. But Margaret wasn't finished. She stepped closer to my mother's row, microphone still in hand, voice dropping to what she probably thought was a confidential murmur. "That's not a mother," she said, loud enough for the nearest 50 people to hear. "That's a mistake in a dress." The microphone caught every word. 204 people heard it. I heard it. My mother heard it. She didn't look up, didn't react, just sat there with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the program like she could disappear into the paper, the way she'd learned to disappear her whole life. Richard Crawford laughed. Not a chuckle, a full laugh, head tilted back, like his wife had just told the funniest joke. Ethan stood at the altar, said nothing, did nothing. His mother had just called mine a mistake, and he looked at his shoes like he was studying the stitching. I felt the ring on my finger, cold metal, heavy. In that moment, I understood everything. Every complicated, every delayed introduction, every time he squeezed my hand instead of opening his mouth. I wasn't marrying a partner, I was marrying a coward. "That's enough." The words came out of my mouth before I knew I was speaking, low and clear and steady as a scalpel. Margaret turned, eyebrows raised, amused. "I'm sorry?" I said that's enough. I stepped forward, took the microphone from her hands. She let me, too surprised to resist, and faced the congregation. "My mother is not a mistake," my voice echoed through that ancient church. "She worked 18-hour days so I could stand here. She gave up everything she had so I could have something better. And she is worth more than every person in this room who laughed." I turned to Ethan, waited. He looked at me, then at his mother, then at his shoes. I pulled the ring off my finger. The diamond caught the light one last time, fractured rainbows scattering across the altar. I set it down on the communion rail, gently, like laying flowers on a grave. "The wedding is cancelled," I said into the microphone. "I apologize for any inconvenience." 204 gasps. I walked off that altar and straight to row 4. "Come on, Mom," I said, taking her arm. "We're leaving." She stood up, trembling, confused. "Sweetheart." "Now, Mom, we're done here." I led her out the door, past the flowers and the candles and the guests who'd come to watch a fairy tale and gotten a revolution instead. But I wasn't done. Not even close. The church doors swung shut behind us, cutting off the murmur of 200 stunned voices. Outside, the June sun was too bright, too cheerful, completely wrong for what had just happened. I stood on the steps of Trinity Church in a wedding dress I'd never use again, holding my mother's arm like she might collapse. Maya. Her voice was barely a whisper. Maya, you didn't have to. Yes, I did. My hands weren't shaking anymore. Something had settled inside me. Not calm exactly, but clear. Crystal clear. Richard Crawford came through the doors behind us, his face the color of raw steak. Young lady, you've just made the biggest mistake of your life. I turned. He stopped. Something in my expression made him stop. $200,000, I said quietly, conversationally, like I was discussing the weather. Shell Company, Meridian Bay Consulting. I know. The red drained out of his face, left behind something gray, something afraid. What? He swallowed. What are you talking about? I'm an auditor, Mr. Crawford, internal auditor, for your company. I smiled, not a nice smile. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? He stared at me. His mouth opened and closed like a fish. Behind him, the church doors opened again. Margaret, Ethan, a cluster of confused relatives. Richard? Margaret's voice was sharp. What's happening? What is she saying? I didn't answer. I just walked Helen down those church steps, my heels clicking on stone, my train dragging through the dust. Maya, wait! Ethan's voice, desperate now. Maya, please, let me explain. I didn't look back. My mother was shaking. Whether from humiliation or relief or fear, I couldn't tell. I held her tighter. It's okay, Mom, I said. We're going home. We got in a cab. The driver looked at my wedding dress, looked at our faces, and wisely said nothing. As we pulled away from the church, I saw Richard Crawford still standing on the steps, phone pressed to his ear, gesturing frantically at someone. Good, let him panic. Maya. My mother's voice was small. What did you mean? About the money? I took her hand, squeezed it. Her fingers were rough against mine, calloused from 30 years of work. I meant, I said, that I'm not done with them, not by a long shot. The cab turned the corner. Trinity Church disappeared behind us. I reached into my pocket. Felt the embroidered handkerchief my grandmother had carried from Ireland. You never know when you'll need proof. I'd spent 6 months finding proof, and now I was going to use it. The apartment in Dorchester hadn't changed in 20 years. Same water stain on the ceiling, same squeak in the third floorboard, same smell of fabric softener and instant coffee. My mother sat on the couch, her bed really, though she'd never call it that, and stared at the wall. I'd hung my wedding dress over the bathroom door. It looked ridiculous there, all that silk and beading crammed into a 5x7 bathroom, but I couldn't look at it anymore. I'm so sorry, sweetheart, Helen's voice cracked. This is all my fault. If I'd just stayed quiet, if I hadn't worn that dress. Mom. I sat beside her, took her hands in mine. You didn't do anything wrong. She did. But you lost? I didn't lose anything. The words came out fierce, certain. I escaped. There's a difference. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and something in her eyes shifted. What are you going to do? I was quiet for a moment. Through the thin walls I could hear our neighbor's TV, a game show host shouting about prizes, normal life, normal problems. I'm going to make them pay, I said, legally, publicly. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what they really are. My mother's hands tightened on mine. How? I stood up, walked to the closet, pulled out the box I'd been adding to for 6 months. Notebooks, printouts, screenshots, everything I'd documented since that first misrouted email. I've been watching them, I said. The Crawfords. Something's wrong with their foundation. Money going missing, transfers to companies that don't exist. I thought I was being paranoid. But after tonight? I set the box on the coffee table, opened it. After tonight, I'm going to find out exactly how deep this goes. My mother looked at the box, at the papers, at me. This could be dangerous, she said. I know. They have money, lawyers, power. I know. She was quiet. Then she reached out and touched my face, the way she used to when I was small. Your grandmother came here with nothing, she said. She built everything from scratch. Never let anyone tell her she was less than. I smiled. It hurt. I'm not going to let anyone tell me that either, Mom. I pulled out my phone, scrolled to a contact I hadn't used in 2 years. Diane Foster, Georgetown Law. Now a civil rights attorney specializing in corporate whistleblower cases. I typed. I need to talk about Crawford. The 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Then, been waiting for this call. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Cambridge. I'll send the address. I stared at the message. My heart was pounding. This was real. This was happening. I wasn't just the girl who walked out of her wedding. I was about to become the woman who brought down an empire. Diane Foster's office was on the 3rd floor of a brick building in Harvard Square, wedged between a bookstore and a Thai restaurant. The kind of place that looked unassuming until you noticed the security cameras. She met me at the door, 35, short dark hair, black blazer, eyes that missed nothing. We'd been roommates freshman year, stayed close through graduation, drifted apart when careers pulled us different directions, but she hadn't hesitated when I reached out. Maya, she hugged me, quick and fierce. I saw the news. News? Someone filmed it. The wedding. It's all over Twitter. I felt sick. Great. It's actually good for us. She ushered me into her office. Small, neat, law books everywhere. Public sympathy is on your side. Margaret Crawford looks like a monster. I sat down, put my notebook on her desk. I'm not here about sympathy. Diane's eyebrows rose. What are you here about? This. I opened the notebook, showed her my documentation. 6 months of observations. The misrouted email, 3 other suspicious transfers, patterns in the foundation's expense reports that didn't match their public filings. She read in silence. Her pen tapped against the desk. Once. Twice. Maya, she said slowly, if this is what I think it is, I don't know what it is yet, but something's wrong, and I want to find out. She closed the notebook, looked at me hard. You understand what you're doing? The Crawfords have resources, lawyers, connections. If you go after them and you're wrong, I'm not wrong. I'm not. If you're right, she continued, they'll come after you with everything they have. They already did. I met her eyes. At my wedding, in front of everyone, they showed me exactly who they are. I'm just returning the favor. A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Same Maya, never backed down from a fight. I just picked better ones. She leaned back in her chair. Okay, here's how this works. You need more than suspicious transfers. You need documentation, forensic analysis. You need to prove intent. How do I do that? You need a forensic accountant, someone who can trace the money, verify the shell companies, build a case that'll hold up in court. She scribbled a name on a notepad. Lena Park, she's the best, and she owes me a favor. I took the paper. The name felt heavy in my hand. There's something else, Diane said. Her voice dropped. Crawford Foundation received $4 million in federal grants last year, HUD funding. If they've been diverting that money... What? If they're misusing federal funds, this isn't just fraud. It's federal wire fraud. That's FBI jurisdiction. The words hung in the air. I'm saying if you can prove what you're suggesting, this could be one of the biggest charity fraud cases in Boston history. She leaned forward. But it has to be done right. Everything legal. Everything documented. No shortcuts. I thought of my mother's hands, the calluses, the scars. No shortcuts, I agreed. Just the truth, Diane nodded. Then let's get started. Lena Park's office looked like what would happen if a spreadsheet became a person and needed somewhere to live. 3 monitors, a whiteboard covered in flowcharts, stacks of paper organized with color-coded tabs. The only personal touch was a dead plant on the windowsill that she'd apparently given up on months ago. Maya Bennett. She shook my hand, firm grip, no nonsense. 31, hair in a practical ponytail, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. Diane says you've got something interesting. Interesting is one word for it. We'd worked together briefly at Crawford Holdings, back when she was consulting on a merger audit. She'd left before I found the discrepancies, but I remembered her. Thorough, relentless, and incapable of letting a number stay wrong. I spread my notebooks across her conference table. 6 months of documentation, every suspicious transfer, every pattern that didn't fit. She studied them in silence, fingers tracing columns, lips moving as she ran calculations in her head. When you were at Crawford, she said finally, did you have authorized access to these financial records? Everything I documented was part of my regular audit duties. So you weren't snooping, you were doing your job. Exactly. She nodded, made a note. Good. We only use what you had legitimate access to. No hacking, no theft, no gray areas. Everything clean, everything defensible in court. For the next 3 hours, we worked. She pulled public records, Foundation 990 filings, HUD grant documentation, anything available through legal channels. She cross-referenced my internal observations with external data. She built a framework, and what emerged was worse than I'd imagined. Maya, she stopped typing, removed her glasses. I need you to sit down. I am sitting. Then stay sitting. She turned one of her monitors toward me. This isn't $200,000. I'm finding discrepancies going back 8 years. The shell company you flagged, Meridian Bay, that's just one of at least 4. And the total, she pointed at a figure on the screen, $4.7 million. That's not a mistake, she said. That's not even negligence. That's a system. Someone built this deliberately. Money comes in from federal grants, gets routed through these shell companies, and ends up… where? She pulled up another document. Corporate registration records. One of the shell companies, Beacon Vista Holdings, is registered to a Margaret L. Crawford. The floor dropped out from under me. Margaret. Not Richard. Margaret. The woman who'd called my mother a mistake. The woman with the Mikimoto pearls and the society smile. The woman who'd looked at me like I was dirt on her designer shoes. She wasn't just cruel. She was a criminal. They've been stealing from homeless shelters, I said slowly. Federal money meant for people with nothing, and they've been stealing it for 8 years. Lena nodded. And now we can prove it. I looked at the number again, $4.7 million. That's a lot of mistakes in dresses. What do we do next? I asked. Lena smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. Now we build a case the FBI can't ignore. Mid-video, CTA number 1. I need to pause here for a moment. If you've made it this far, if you're listening to this and you've ever felt like someone dismissed you because of where you came from, or what your parents did, or how much money was in your bank account, I want you to know something. You're not alone. And those people? They're not as powerful as they want you to believe. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever been in a situation like this, where someone made you feel small and you wished you could do something about it? And if you haven't already, please subscribe. Because what happens next with the Crawfords, you're not going to want to miss it. Now, let me tell you about the phone call that changed everything. 3 days after the wedding that wasn't, my phone buzzed with an email from an address I didn't recognize. Ms. Bennett, I've been investigating Crawford Foundation for 2 years. Sources tell me you may have relevant information. We should talk. Discretion guaranteed. Marcus Webb, Boston Globe. I stared at the screen. Then I called Diane. Marcus Webb? She sounded impressed. He's legit. Broke the city council corruption story last year. He's careful, ethical, and he doesn't burn sources. Should I meet with him? Not yet. Not until we've filed the whistleblower complaint. Once that's in, you have legal protection. Before that, you're vulnerable. But she gave me his number anyway. When the time is right, she said. Having a journalist in your corner isn't a bad thing. 2 weeks later, after Lena had compiled her initial analysis and Diane had drafted the federal complaint, I called him. We met at a bar in the North End, dark, quiet, the kind of place where people went to not be overheard. Marcus Webb was exactly what you'd expect from an investigative journalist. 42, tired eyes, rumpled jacket, a voice recorder he set on the table between us like a challenge. Ms. Bennett? He didn't smile, didn't waste time. I'm not going to ask you what you have. I'm going to ask you what you want. The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? I mean, a lot of people in your situation want money. Revenge. They're 15 minutes. He shrugged. I don't care about any of that. I care about the truth, so what do you want? I thought about my mother in row 4, about Margaret's laugh, about $4.7 million that should have helped homeless families sleep in beds instead of doorways. I want justice, I said, for my mother, for the people that money was supposed to help. I want everyone to know what the Crawfords really are. He studied me for a long moment. Then we might be able to work together. He leaned forward, lowered his voice. I have a source inside the FBI. They've been looking at Crawford Foundation for years, but they've never had enough for a warrant, never had anyone from the inside. My mouth went dry. And now? Now they might have you. His eyes didn't waver. If you're willing. I thought about Diane's warnings, the risk, the power the Crawfords had. Then I thought about my grandmother's handkerchief in my pocket, about a woman who came to this country with nothing and refused to be beaten. I'm willing, I said. Marcus nodded, just once. Respect. Then let's take them down. The first letter arrived exactly 1 week after I walked out of that church. Dear Ms. Bennett, your employment with Crawford Holdings has been terminated effective immediately, pursuant to Section 12.4 of your employment contract, violation of confidentiality provisions. I read it 3 times, violation of confidentiality, as if I'd leaked trade secrets instead of documenting fraud. The second letter came the next day. Law firm letterhead. Cromwell, Stevens & White, the kind of firm that charged $800 an hour to make problems disappear. Defamatory statements made at the June 14th event. Demand immediate retraction. Prepared to pursue legal action. They were calling my speech at the altar defamation, my defense of my mother, my statement of basic truth. Ethan called that night. Maya, his voice was exhausted. You need to stop. Whatever you're doing, you need to stop. Whatever I'm doing? I don't know what you said to my father, but he paused. They're scared, and when they're scared, they're dangerous. Are you calling to warn me, Ethan, or to threaten me? I'm calling because Another pause, longer. Because I care about you. You cared about me so much you stood there while your mother called mine a mistake. Silence. Are you calling to protect me, I asked, or to protect them? He didn't answer. I hadn't expected him to. Goodbye, Ethan. I hung up. That night, a black sedan parked outside my mother's apartment. It sat there for 3 hours, engine idling, windows tinted. I photographed the license plate, sent it to Diane. They're trying to intimidate you, she texted back. Classic move. It means you're getting to them. I looked out the window at that car, at the shadow behind the wheel. 2 months ago, I would have been terrified. 2 months ago, I would have backed down. But that was before Margaret Crawford taught me that silence was just another word for surrender. I pulled out my grandmother's handkerchief, ran my thumb over the embroidered forget-me-nots. They're scared, I said out loud. To no one, to myself. Good. The next morning, the sedan was gone, but I knew they weren't done, and neither was I. Lena called me on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the wedding. "Can you come in? Now?" Something in her voice made me grab my coat without asking questions. When I got to her office, she was standing at the whiteboard. She'd erased the flowcharts I'd seen before. In their place was a single diagram, a web of lines connecting boxes with dates and dollar amounts. "Sit down," she said. "You keep telling me that. Because you keep needing to." I sat. "The $200,000 you flagged? The Meridian Bay transfer?" She pointed to a box at the top of the diagram. "That was nothing. That was a test, maybe. Or a mistake." "What do you mean, nothing?" "I mean, I found the rest." She handed me a printout, pages and pages of transactions, shell companies, routing numbers. 8 years of data, cross-referenced with their public filings, their grant applications, their 990s. I scanned the pages. Numbers blurred together. "What am I looking at?" "You're looking at $4.7 million, she said it flatly. Not 1.2, which is what I thought at first. $4.7 million diverted from Crawford Foundation to private accounts over 8 years. I couldn't breathe. "And it gets worse." She flipped to another page. "See this shell company? Beacon Vista Holdings? You mentioned it before, Margaret's company." "Right. But look at what it received." She circled a number. 3.2 million of that 4.7 directly to a company in her name. I stared at the figure. The money that was supposed to help homeless families went to Margaret Crawford. Lena nodded. "The woman who lives in a mansion on Beacon Hill, who wears pearls that cost more than most people's cars. That woman has been stealing from the homeless for almost a decade." Something cold settled in my chest. "She called my mother a mistake," I said slowly, "while wearing stolen jewelry, standing in a church paid for with stolen donations, looking down on a woman who's worked harder in 1 year than she's worked in her entire life." Lena was quiet. "Maya," she said finally, "this is bigger than your wedding. This is federal. This could bring down the whole family." I thought about Richard Crawford's face when I mentioned the shell company, the fear, the sudden pallor. "They know," I said. "They know what they did, and they know I know. Which is why we need to move fast." Lena straightened the papers. "I've prepared a complete forensic analysis. Every transaction, every connection, chain of custody, source documentation, everything the FBI will need. How soon can we file? Diane's finalizing the whistleblower complaint now. We should be ready in a week." 1 week. 7 days until the Crawfords would learn that the seamstress's daughter wasn't just a humiliated bride. She was the witness who would end them. Ethan appeared at my door without warning, 2 days before we planned to file. He looked terrible, unshaven, dark circles under his eyes. His shirt was wrinkled. Ethan, who'd never worn a wrinkled shirt in his life. "Maya." He stood in the hallway like he was afraid to come closer. "Can we talk?" I didn't invite him in. "Talk. I know what you're doing. I know you've been—" He swallowed. "Investigating. The foundation. I know." My blood went cold. "How do you know that? Does it matter?" He ran a hand through his hair. "My parents are losing their minds. Lawyers, private investigators. They're trying to find out what you have. And you came here to warn me?" "I came here because—" He stopped, started again. "Because I should have said something at the wedding. I should have stood up." "Yes, you should have. I was a coward," his voice cracked. "I've always been a coward. My whole life I've done what they wanted because it was easier. Because they have everything. They could take everything from me." I leaned against the doorframe. "So what changed?" I started listening. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time since the church. I heard things, conversations, my parents talking about the foundation, about money, about— He shook his head. Things that didn't make sense until you said that name. Meridian Bay. I didn't react. Didn't confirm. I have access, he said quietly, to emails, records, things you wouldn't have been able to see as an auditor. He hesitated. I could get you more. Why would you do that? Because they're wrong. His voice was barely above a whisper. What they're doing, what they did to you, to your mother, it's wrong. And I'm tired of pretending it isn't. I studied him. The boy I'd loved or thought I loved. The man who'd stayed silent when he should have roared. You want my forgiveness, I said. No. He shook his head. I don't deserve that. I just want... He paused. I want to do the right thing, even if it's too late. I thought about Diane's warnings, about the risk of accepting help from someone inside the Crawford family, about the possibility that this was a trap. But I also thought about the evidence Lena needed, the connections that could seal the case. If you want to do the right thing, I said, talk to my lawyer, not me, and bring everything you have. He nodded, slowly. I can do that. And Ethan? I waited until he met my eyes. This doesn't change anything between us. You understand that? I know. He swallowed. I lost you the moment I stayed silent. I've known that since the church. He turned to go. Ethan. He stopped. Why now? Really? He was quiet for a long moment. Because I looked at my mother in that church, he said, laughing, while yours cried, and I realized... His voice broke. I realized I never want to become her. I never want to be that person. He walked away without looking back. I closed the door. And I wondered if I'd just gained an ally, or walked into the biggest mistake of my life. Diane's conference room felt different on the day I signed. The same law books, the same practical furniture. But the air was thicker somehow, charged with the weight of what we were about to do. 127 pages. That's how long the whistleblower complaint was. 127 pages of documentation, analysis, and evidence compiled by Diane's legal team, verified by Lena's forensic work, and supported by everything I'd gathered over 6 months of watching and waiting. Once you sign this, Diane said, there's no going back. The complaint gets filed under seal with the federal court. The FBI opens a formal investigation, and you become a protected whistleblower under federal law. Which means if the Crawfords try to retaliate, fire you, sue you, intimidate you, they add obstruction and witness tampering to their list of charges. She almost smiled. They'd be handing us more evidence. Lena sat beside me, quiet and steady. She'd worked 18-hour days for the past week, triple-checking every number, every connection. It's solid, she said. The forensic trail is clean. The FBI will have everything they need. I looked at the papers in front of me. 127 pages of truth. I thought about my mother in row 4, about the handkerchief in my pocket, about my grandmother who came to this country with nothing and built a life through sheer refusal to quit. I thought about Margaret Crawford in her pearls, laughing at my mother's dress, and I signed. My name looked strange on the page, small but permanent. That's it, Diane said. It's done. I exhaled. For months, I'd been gathering evidence in secret, not sure if I was paranoid or right, not sure if any of it would matter. Now it was real, official, unstoppable. My phone buzzed. Marcus Webb, FBI wants to meet. They're calling this a priority. Case might be bigger than we thought, possibly connected to city officials. I showed Diane the message. Well, she said, looks like the Crawfords are about to have a very bad week. I put my phone away. My mother had taught me to write everything down, to keep proof, to protect myself. She just didn't know that someday I'd use those lessons to protect everyone the Crawfords had ever stolen from. The seamstress's daughter was about to bring down an empire. The FBI field office in Boston smelled like coffee and paper and barely contained urgency. Special Agent Thomas Riley met me at the elevator. 50 years old, salt and pepper hair, a face that had seen too many lies to believe anything easily. He shook my hand with a grip that was firm, but not unfriendly. "Ms. Bennett." His voice was even, professional. "Thank you for coming in." The interview room was exactly what you'd expect: sterile, quiet, a table with a recording device in the center. But there was something in Riley's manner that felt almost respectful, like he was grateful I was there. "I'll be direct," he said, settling into his chair. "We've been watching Crawford Foundation for 5 years. Every time we got close, the trail went cold. Lawyers, shell companies, dead ends. What changed?" He looked at me steadily. "You did." He opened a file on the table. I recognized Lena's forensic analysis. "Your documentation fills gaps we couldn't fill, connects dots we couldn't connect, and combined with the testimony your attorney forwarded from Mr. Ethan Crawford," he paused, "we have enough for a warrant." Ethan had followed through. He'd given Diane everything: emails, internal memos, even recordings of conversations he'd had with his parents. It wasn't enough to make me forgive him, but it was enough to matter. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we move fast." Riley leaned forward. "The Crawfords have resources. If they get wind that we're coming, they'll start destroying evidence, moving money, hiding trails. We need to execute search warrants before they know what hit them." "When?" 3 days. He met my eyes. "And I need you to understand something, Ms. Bennett. This case may be bigger than just the foundation. Some of the money trails lead to city contracts, political donations. This could touch a lot of powerful people." I thought about the black sedan outside my mother's apartment, about the threatening letters, about Margaret Crawford's smile. "I understand." Riley nodded. "Once. Respect. We're going to need you to testify eventually. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about standing at that altar, about finding my voice when everyone expected me to stay silent. "I've been preparing for this my whole life," I said. "I just didn't know it." He almost smiled. "Then let's take them down." My phone buzzed as I left the building. Unknown number. "You think you've won? We know everything. This isn't over." The message was sent from a number linked to one of the shell companies. I screenshotted it, forwarded it to Riley. "Evidence of intimidation," I typed. "Thank you for making my case stronger." Then I walked out into the Boston afternoon, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something like hope. The morning of the raid, I woke to breaking news. My phone lit up with alerts. FBI executes search warrants at Crawford Holdings. Boston real estate dynasty. Under federal investigation. 2 arrested in charity fraud probe. I sat in my mother's apartment, coffee growing cold in my hands, and watched it unfold on television. Footage from Beacon Hill, FBI agents carrying boxes out of the Crawford mansion, evidence bags, computer equipment, and Margaret Crawford walking down her own front steps in handcuffs. No pearls, no perfectly styled hair, no society smile, just a 60-year-old woman in a rumpled blazer, face pale, eyes wild with disbelief, being led to a waiting vehicle like every other criminal and every other perp walk in history. Richard was behind her, hands cuffed, face gray, not laughing now. My mother came out of the kitchen and stood beside me. "Is that?" "Yes." We watched in silence. The news anchor was talking about federal fraud charges, about charity money diverted to private accounts, about an investigation that had been building for years. She mentioned an anonymous whistleblower. Someone inside the organization. "Maya." My mother's voice was quiet. "Did you do this?" I looked at her, at the woman who had worked 18-hour days so I could have a future, the woman Margaret Crawford had called a mistake. "Yes, Mom, I did." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached out and took my hand. Her fingers were rough against mine, calloused from 30 years of work, but her grip was strong. "I'm not happy someone had to be arrested," she said softly, "but I'm proud of you, sweetheart. So proud." My phone buzzed. Diane. They found everything. Second set of books, emails, bank records. The Crawfords are done. Then another message. And there's more. Crawford Holdings is calling an emergency board meeting tomorrow. They're going to try to control the narrative. Press will be there. I stared at the screen. Maya? My mother was watching my face. What is it? The board meeting, I said. They're going to try to spin this, make it look like a misunderstanding. Can they do that? I thought about Margaret Crawford, who even in handcuffs had probably been calculating her next move. They can try. I stood up, but I'm not going to let them. Mid-video CTA number 2. Hold on. I need to pause right here, because we're about to get to the part everyone asks me about, the board meeting. The moment I walked back into Crawford Holdings, not as the humiliated bride, not as the fired auditor, but as something else entirely. Before we get there, if you're still watching, you're my kind of person. You believe in justice. You believe that people shouldn't get away with cruelty just because they have money. So do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment and tell me, if you were in my position, would you go to that meeting? Would you face them again? I want to know what you would do. Okay, let me tell you about the most terrifying and satisfying morning of my life. The night before the board meeting, we gathered in Diane's office. Me, Diane, Lena, and Marcus. War Council. They're going to claim this is a misunderstanding, Marcus said, flipping through his notes. Anonymous source tells me their PR firm has been working overtime. The script is accounting irregularities, internal review, cooperating fully with authorities, standard damage control. They can't spin their way out of handcuffs, Lena said. They'll try. Diane leaned back in her chair. Richard and Margaret are out on bail, $2 million each. They'll be at the board meeting, making their case for why they should stay in charge while the misunderstanding gets sorted out. So what do we do? I asked. You? Diane shook her head. Nothing. You've done your part. The FBI has the evidence. Let the system work. That's not good enough. Everyone looked at me. They're going to stand up in that room, I said, in front of cameras and journalists and board members, and lie. They're going to say this is all a mistake, that they're victims, that the real problem is, what, disgruntled employees? Misguided prosecutors? I thought about my mother's face when Margaret called her a mistake. I can't let that happen. Marcus spoke first. You could attend. The board meeting is technically public. Shareholders and stakeholders can observe. If you're there... What? Diane cut in. If she's there, what? She makes a scene? Gives them ammunition to paint her as unstable? I won't make a scene. My voice was calm. But I can make a statement. Just by being there. Just by letting them see me. Diane studied my face for a long moment. You understand the risks. They could claim harassment, intimidation. I'm not going to threaten anyone. I'm not going to disrupt anything. I met her eyes. I'm just going to stand there and remind them that I exist, that the woman they tried to destroy isn't destroyed. Silence. Then Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him. That might actually work. Lena nodded slowly. It would send a message, to the board, to the press. Diane sighed. Fine. But we do it smart. You observe only, unless they invite you to speak, and if they ask you anything, you defer to your attorney. She pointed at herself. Me. Agreed. That night, I went home and tried on the blazer I'd worn to my first job interview at Crawford Holdings. Black, tailored, professional. My mother appeared in the doorway. What's that for? Tomorrow. I smoothed the lapels. I'm going to a meeting. She watched me for a moment, then she disappeared and came back with something in her hands. The handkerchief. The one with the embroidered forget-me-nots. Take this with you, she said. So I'm there too. I tucked it into my blazer pocket. Tomorrow I would walk back into the building where I'd been humiliated, fired, and threatened. And I would do it with my grandmother's handkerchief over my heart. The night before, my mother and I sat on the old couch until long after midnight. The apartment was quiet. Through the thin walls, I could hear the neighbor's TV, some reality show where people competed for money and love. Normal problems, simple stakes. "Are you scared?" Helen asked. I considered lying, but we were past that now. "Terrified," I admitted. "Then why are you doing it?" I looked at her, really looked at her. At the lines around her eyes, earned through decades of work. At the hands that had made my graduation dress, my wedding dress, 1,000 other dresses for people who never knew her name. "Because if I don't," I said, "they win. Not just against me, against everyone they've ever hurt. Every family that didn't get help because Margaret Crawford was buying pearls with their grant money. Every person who slept on the street while she slept in a mansion." My mother was quiet. "And because of you," I added softly, "because she looked at you, the strongest person I know, and called you a mistake. And she laughed." Helen's eyes glistened. "I need them to see," I said. "I need the whole world to see that you're not a mistake, that I'm not a mistake, that the things they tried to make us ashamed of, where we come from, how we live, what we've had to do to survive, those are the things that make us strong." My mother reached out and touched my face. "You're just like your grandmother," she said. "She came here with nothing, but she never let anyone tell her she was less than. Neither did you." She smiled, sad and proud all at once. "Neither will you." I leaned my head on her shoulder, the way I used to when I was small. "Whatever happens tomorrow," I said, "thank you. For everything. For teaching me to fight." She kissed my hair. "Thank you for fighting." We sat there until the first gray light of dawn crept through the window. Then I got dressed for battle. Crawford Holdings rose 30 stories above the financial district, all glass and steel and reflected clouds. I'd worked here for 3 years, walked through that lobby 1,000 times, but I'd never felt the weight of it before, the intimidation built into every surface, designed to make ordinary people feel small. Today, I refused to feel small. Diane walked beside me, black suit, briefcase, game face. The security guard at the desk looked up, recognized me. His eyes went wide. "Ms. Bennett, you're not... I mean, your badge was deactivated." "I'm aware." Diane stepped forward. "My client is a witness in an ongoing federal investigation and has a legal right to attend this public shareholder meeting." She produced a document. "Here's the relevant statute." The guard looked at the paper, looked at me, called someone on his phone. 5 minutes later, we were in the elevator, rising toward the 30th floor. "How are you feeling?" Diane asked quietly. "Like I'm about to walk into a lion's den." "You are," she almost smiled. "But the lions don't have teeth anymore." The doors opened. The boardroom was floor-to-ceiling windows, mahogany table, crystal water pitchers. 20 chairs around the table, all filled. Another 30 observers along the walls, shareholders, lawyers, and 5 journalists with recorders. Marcus was among them. He gave me an almost imperceptible nod. And at the head of the table, Richard Crawford, Margaret beside him. They looked diminished. Richard was pale, his suit slightly loose like he'd lost weight. Margaret wore no pearls. They'd been seized as assets. Her hair was in a practical bun, no society smile. When I walked in, the room went silent. 20 faces turned. Margaret's eyes found mine. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Fear, rage, recognition. Then she recovered, lifted her chin, forced that cold smile. "Well," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "if it isn't the girl who thinks she won." I said nothing. Diane and I took seats along the wall. I folded my hands in my lap, kept my face neutral. Margaret leaned toward Richard, whispered something. Richard's knuckles were white on the table. "Let's begin," Harrison Wells said from his seat near the head of the table. He was the largest shareholder outside the Crawford family, 65, silver-haired, the kind of man who hadn't survived 50 years in Boston real estate by ignoring which way the wind was blowing. We have a lot to discuss. Richard Crawford stood, buttoning his jacket with fingers that weren't quite steady. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. His voice was controlled, measured, the voice of a man who'd spent 40 years dominating boardrooms. I know there's been concern about recent events. He paced slowly, hands clasped behind his back. What we're dealing with is a misunderstanding, an aggressive investigation based on flawed information, accounting irregularities that have been blown out of proportion by, he gestured vaguely, individuals with personal vendettas. His eyes flicked to me, just for a second. Crawford Holdings has built a legacy of integrity over 4 generations. We're not going to let one disgruntled former employee destroy that. Margaret nodded beside him, chin high. We're cooperating fully with authorities, Richard continued, and I'm confident that when all the facts come to light, this board will see that these charges are baseless. He sat. Silence. Then Harrison Wells cleared his throat. Richard. His voice was measured but heavy. With respect, the FBI didn't execute search warrants and make arrests because of accounting irregularities. They seized evidence of systematic fraud going back 8 years. Richard opened his mouth. I've seen the warrant documentation, Wells continued. We all have. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is criminal. Margaret leaned forward. Harrison, you've known us for 30 years. I have. He cut her off. Which is why I never suspected. But the evidence doesn't lie, and pretending otherwise insults everyone at this table. Murmurs around the room. I propose, Wells said, that before we discuss damage control, we hear from all relevant parties. He turned, looked directly at me. Ms. Bennett, would you be willing to address the board? The room held its breath. Diane touched my arm. You don't have to, but I was already standing. Yes, I said, I would. I walked to the head of the table. 20 faces watched me. Richard Crawford's jaw was tight. Margaret's hands were clenched in her lap. I didn't look at them. Not yet. My name is Maya Bennett, I said. For 3 years, I was an internal auditor at this company, and for 6 months, I watched something wrong happen. I paused. Let the words settle. I'm not here to talk about accounting. The FBI will present that evidence in court. I'm here because someone in this room, I finally looked at Margaret, decided that my mother was a joke. The room was silent. At my wedding, Mrs. Crawford took a microphone and told 200 people that my mother was, and I quote, a mistake in a dress. I kept my voice steady, professional. My mother is a seamstress. She raised me alone. She worked 18-hour days so I could get an education, so I could stand in rooms like this. Margaret's face was stone. And while Mrs. Crawford was mocking my mother's handmade dress, she was wearing pearls bought with stolen money. I let that hang. Money from federal grants, money meant for homeless shelters, for families with nothing. I gestured at the stack of folders on the table, the forensic analysis Lena had prepared. $4.7 million. That's not a misunderstanding, that's theft. From the most vulnerable people in this city. Richard stood up. You have no right. I have every right. My voice didn't waver. I was the auditor who found the discrepancies. I was the employee who asked questions. And I was the woman you tried to silence. I turned to Harrison Wells. You asked me to address the board. Here's what I have to say. The Crawfords built their reputation on a lie. They stole from people who had nothing. And they did it while looking down on everyone they considered beneath them. I looked at Margaret one last time. My mother is not a mistake. She's the reason I'm standing here. And I promise you, my voice hardened, she's worth more than every stolen pearl you ever wore. The boardroom doors opened. Special Agent Riley walked in with 2 FBI agents. Richard Crawford, Margaret Crawford. His voice was calm, official. "You're under arrest pursuant to federal indictment on charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy." Margaret's face went white. An agent produced handcuffs. As they led the Crawfords out, past the cameras, past the journalists, past every board member they'd ever intimidated, Margaret turned to look at me. Her eyes burned with fury. I didn't look away. The handcuffs clicked shut with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Richard Crawford stood rigid as the FBI agent secured his wrists, his face the color of wet cement. 40 years of commanding rooms, of making deals, of being untouchable, ended by a single metal click. Margaret was worse. She was shaking. "This is a mistake," she hissed at Riley. "Do you know who we are? Do you have any idea what you're doing?" "Ma'am?" Riley's voice was utterly flat. "I know exactly who you are. That's why you're being arrested." The journalists' cameras were flashing, recorders held high. This was the shot that would lead every newscast for a week. "You'll regret this." Margaret's eyes found me across the room, wild, desperate. "You're nothing. You're nobody. You think you've won, but we have lawyers. We have—" "Margaret." Richard's voice was quiet, defeated. "Stop." She stopped. For one moment they just looked at each other. 40 years of marriage, 4 generations of legacy, and now handcuffs and cameras and the long walk of shame. "Richard Crawford is removed from his position as chairman, effective immediately," Harrison Wells announced to the room. "The board will appoint interim leadership and cooperate fully with federal authorities." 2 FBI agents led the Crawfords toward the door. Margaret passed within 3 feet of me. "You'll pay for this," she whispered. "Whatever it takes." I held her gaze. "Your threats don't scare me anymore, Mrs. Crawford." My voice was calm, almost kind. "And you'll have plenty of time to think about that in federal prison." The doors closed behind them. The room erupted. Journalists shouted questions. Board members huddled in frantic conversation. Someone knocked over a water pitcher. Marcus Webb caught my eye and grinned. Diane appeared at my elbow. "Let's go. You've done everything you came here to do." I nodded, but as I turned toward the exit, I stopped. Because there, in the corner of the room, stood Ethan Crawford. He hadn't been arrested. The FBI had confirmed his cooperation, granted him immunity in exchange for testimony. He was pale, hollow. Watching his parents led away in handcuffs, our eyes met. I didn't smile, didn't nod. I just looked at him, at the man who'd stayed silent when he should have spoken, who'd finally done the right thing when it was almost too late. Then I walked out. In the lobby, my mother was waiting. She stood by the elevator bank, clutching her old purse, looking completely out of place in the gleaming corporate shrine. The security guards were watching her uncertainly. "Mom?" I stopped. "What are you doing here?" "I watched the news." Her voice was thick. "I had to come." She opened her arms. I walked into them. We stood there in the lobby of Crawford Holdings, the building that had witnessed my humiliation and my triumph, and we held each other. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it." "We did it," I said. "Your lessons, your strength, that's what did it." She pulled back, looked at me, tears streaming down her face. "Let's go home, sweetheart." "Yeah," I smiled. "Let's go home." The news broke like a dam. By evening, Crawford Foundation fraud was trending nationwide. Every outlet in Boston led with the story. The footage was everywhere. Margaret Crawford in handcuffs, face contorted with fury. Richard's gray silence. The FBI carrying boxes of evidence from the Beacon Hill mansion. Boston Globe exclusive. Charity fraud scheme diverted 4.7 M from homeless shelters to private accounts. New York Times. Boston real estate dynasty faces federal charges in massive grant. Fraud case CNN. Whistleblower wedding drama leads to FBI arrests. The internet had opinions. "This is the most satisfying thing I've read in years." That seamstress raised one hell of a daughter. Margaret Crawford spent stolen money from homeless people and had the audacity to mock someone's handmade dress. Karma. I tried not to read the comments. Failed. Read them anyway. In our apartment, my mother and I sat together on the old couch, the TV muted, our phones buzzing with messages we didn't answer. It feels strange, she said quietly. All these people talking about us. They're not talking about us. I put my arm around her. They're talking about justice. She was quiet for a moment. Maya, she turned to face me. Do you feel better? Now that it's done? I thought about it. Really thought. I feel free, I said finally. Like I've been carrying something heavy for months and now it's gone. Not happy? Not exactly. I tried to find the right words. I don't think anyone wins when people go to prison, even people who deserve it. But I'm glad the truth came out. I'm glad the people they stole from might get justice. She nodded slowly. My phone buzzed again. Diane, FBI confirms, full whistleblower award processing underway. Estimated 15% of recovered funds, looking at $650K minimum. I stared at the message. $650,000. For telling the truth, for doing the right thing. Mom. My voice came out strange. I need to show you something. I handed her the phone. She read it again, looked up at me with wide eyes. Is this real? It's real. She started to cry. Not sadness, not grief. The kind of crying that happens when something you never dared to hope for suddenly becomes possible. I held her. This is yours too, I said. This is for every 18-hour day, every rent payment that nearly broke us, every sacrifice you made so I could have a chance. She shook her head. I didn't do anything. You did everything. I pulled back, looked her in the eyes. And now it's my turn to take care of you. 3 months later, the world had moved on, but the consequences hadn't. I followed the case obsessively. Every hearing, every filing, every new development. Richard Crawford faced 14 federal charges: wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to defraud the United States. His lawyers filed motion after motion, but the evidence was overwhelming. Lena's forensic analysis, the internal emails, Ethan's testimony. If convicted on all counts, he was looking at 15 to 20 years. Margaret faced 8 charges, slightly less exposure because her role was more concealed. But Beacon Vista Holdings, the shell company in her name, had received $3.2 million of the diverted funds. The woman with the Mikimoto pearls would be answering for every dollar. Both were out on bail, $2 million each. Margaret wore an ankle monitor and couldn't leave Massachusetts. Her passport had been surrendered. Crawford Holdings stock had cratered, down 60% from its peak. The company was in restructuring mode under court supervision. The board had appointed a crisis management team. The Crawford name, which had meant something in Boston for 4 generations, now meant something else entirely. The foundation was dissolved. Its remaining legitimate assets were transferred to actual homeless services organizations. A federal receiver was overseeing the process. And I received official notification of my whistleblower award, $650,000, pursuant to the False Claims Act's quitam provisions. It arrived in a certified letter. I read it 3 times. Then I called Diane. It's real, she confirmed. The funds will be released within 60 days. After taxes and my fee, you're looking at roughly $400,000. $400,000. More money than my mother had earned in her entire life. That night, Ethan sent me an email. Maya, I know you probably won't respond to this. I don't expect you to. But I wanted you to know, I'm going to testify against them, at the trial. Everything I know, everything I saw. It won't change what happened between us. It won't make up for the wedding, or my silence, or any of it. But you were right, about all of it. And I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. Ethan. I read it twice. Then I closed the email without responding. Some apologies are too late to accept, but at least he was finally making the right choice. The sign in the window said, Helen's Alterations and Custom Designs, gold letters on deep green, elegant but not pretentious. My mother had chosen it herself. The shop was small, 800 square feet on a corner in Dorchester, 2 blocks from the apartment where we'd lived my whole childhood. But it had good light, a clean layout, and enough room for 3 sewing stations. More importantly, it belonged to her. I'd used part of my whistleblower award for the down payment. The rest went into equipment, inventory, and a 6-month operating cushion so she could build her client base without panic. You didn't have to do this, she said for the 100th time, running her fingers along the cutting table. It's too much. It's not enough, I said. It's 30 years too late, but it's a start. Opening day was quiet. A few neighbors came by to see the new shop. An old customer from the dry cleaner heard about it and brought in 3 dresses for alterations. But by noon, something shifted. A woman walked in, 40-something, well-dressed, vaguely familiar. She looked around the shop, then at my mother. You're Helen Bennett? Yes. I saw the news, about your daughter, about what she did. The woman's eyes were bright. I own a boutique in the South End, high-end stuff. We've been using a tailor in Newton, but… She paused. I'd rather give my business to someone local, someone real. She handed my mother a card. Call me. I'd like to discuss a partnership. After she left, my mother stared at the card for a long time. Maya, she said, this is happening. It's happening. I hugged her. It was always going to happen. You just needed someone to see you. That evening, I watched her close up the shop. She moved slowly, reverently, running her hands over the sewing machines, the fabric bolts, the handwritten price list she'd made herself. She stopped at the window, touched the glass where the sign hung. Helen's, she said softly. My name. Your name, I agreed. She turned to me. Her eyes were wet. Thank you, sweetheart. For everything. For fighting. I thought about Margaret Crawford, about stolen pearls and homeless shelters and a woman who thought she could mock her way through life without consequences. Thank you for teaching me how, I said. My mother reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, familiar. The handkerchief, the one with the forget-me-nots. I made you a new one. She unfolded a second handkerchief, white linen, my name embroidered in blue thread. So you'll always remember. I took it, pressed it to my heart. I'll never forget, I said, and I meant it. And I meant, 6 months after the wedding that wasn't, I walked into an office building I'd never visited before. The National Whistleblower Center occupied a modest floor in a downtown high-rise. No marble lobbies, no crystal chandeliers, just carpet and cubicles and people doing quiet, important work. They'd offered me a position 3 weeks earlier. Advisory consultant, helping other whistleblowers navigate the system I'd survived. The pay was less than half what I'd made at Crawford Holdings. The hours were irregular, the benefits were modest. I said yes immediately. You understand, the director had said during my interview, that this work can be frustrating. Not every case succeeds. Not every whistleblower is protected. I understand, I'd replied. But some are, and those are worth fighting for. That first morning I arrived early, made coffee in the communal kitchen, read through case files that would become my responsibility. At 10 o'clock, a young woman appeared in my doorway, 24, maybe 25. Dark circles under her eyes, clutching a folder like a lifeline. Are you Maya Bennett? Her voice was barely above a whisper. I am. I saw the news, about the Crawfords, about what you did. She swallowed. I'm in a situation, at my company, and I don't know what to do. I thought about myself, 6 months ago, scared, isolated, convinced I was powerless. Sit down, I said gently. Tell me everything. She talked for an hour, about irregularities she'd noticed, about supervisors who dismissed her concerns, about fear and confusion and the feeling that she was losing her mind. I don't know if I can do this, she said finally. I don't know if I'm strong enough. I looked at her, at this stranger who reminded me so much of myself, and I thought about my mother's hands, my grandmother's handkerchief, all the women who had come before me, who had survived and fought and refused to be silenced. You're not alone, I said, and you're stronger than you know. The first step is always the hardest, but I'll help you take it. She started to cry. I handed her a tissue and the handkerchief my mother had made me. Keep this for now, I said. Bring it back when you're ready. She looked at the embroidered letters, at my name. Why? She asked. Because someone helped me when I needed it. I smiled. Now it's my turn. People ask me if it was worth it. The lost marriage, the lost job, the lost future I thought I was going to have. Here's what I tell them. I didn't lose anything. I escaped. I escaped a marriage to a man who couldn't stand up for me. I left a job at a company that was built on theft. I walked away from a future that would have required me to be silent about injustice. Those aren't losses. Those are survivals. What I kept matters more. I kept my mother, and I got to give her something she'd never had. Her own business, her own name on the door, her own future that doesn't depend on anyone else's approval. I kept my integrity. I told the truth when telling the truth was hard. I stood up when standing up was scary. And I kept my voice. The one Margaret Crawford tried to silence with mockery. The one the Crawfords tried to bury with lawyers. The one that turned out to be stronger than all their money combined. I don't know what happens next for me. I'm taking classes at night, learning the law, thinking about ways to help other people who find themselves where I was. I do know this. I will never again be silent when someone I love is being hurt. I will never again pretend that cruelty is acceptable just because it comes from power. And I will never let anyone make me feel ashamed of where I came from. My grandmother came to this country with nothing but a handkerchief and her own 2 hands. My mother raised me alone with nothing but a sewing machine and her stubborn, beautiful heart. And I brought down a $200 million empire with nothing but the truth. That's not a story about revenge. That's a story about justice. If you're listening to this and you're in a situation where someone is making you feel small, where you're being told to be quiet, to accept mistreatment, to let powerful people get away with cruelty, I want you to know something. You are not powerless. You are not alone. And the best way to protect the people you love is to refuse to be silent. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. And leave me a comment. Tell me, if you could say one thing to the past version of yourself who was putting up with something they shouldn't have, what would you say? I read every single comment. You matter to me. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for believing in justice. I'm Maya Bennett, and this was my story.